I can dedicate 20 hours a week to training. I'd also like to incorporate a couple of runs each week if it doesn't negatively affect my cycling performance too much. That's like, there's a lot of cycling memes in all of this right here. He says, what modifications to my plan would you recommend? So just to recap here, he's going through sweet spot base high volume, or he went through the base phase of high volume, and now he's going into, I guess, the century plan here. But he can dedicate 20 hours per week, also kind of wants to run. So what modifications would you recommend, Chad?
Yeah, honestly, if I could just recommend one thing, I think it's an easy thing to overlook. And even in the planning meeting, we overlook this, is to sleep more. So unless you're already getting 9 hours at night, and not too many of us are, sleep more. And that might mean for a little while, just staying in bed longer. Sleep may not come just right out of the gate, but sleep more. Even if ideally you can push yourself up to 9 hours. I know some people, I think even Nate tries to shoot for 10. So when the training load's high, they try to make sure, yep, there you go. Try to make sure that we're getting, somewhere more toward 9 to 10 hours than that 7 to 8 or 6 to 7 that a lot of people usually, that's all they can cram in there. But if you have the luxury of more time, dedicate some of it to more sleep. And a couple of tips in the direction of doing so is, you don't just get into bed and expect to sleep an hour longer. That's not typically how it works. It's a transition. So go to bed a half hour earlier. You've probably heard all this advice before, but I'm going to offer it one more time. Go to bed a half hour earlier, get used to that, then go to bed a half hour earlier, get used to that. If you can do just that, you've added 1 extra hour of sleep, or at least rack time. Over the course of 7 days, that's an extra night of sleep every week, just like that, for that one small modification. And I promise you it will pay very big dividends. And in line with all this, if you haven't already done these things, make sure you improve your sleep hygiene. And a couple of the most obvious ways to do it are set a consistent bedtime and abide it.
Kate Courtney mentioned,
avoid blue light sources.
Sorry, Chad, but Kate Courtney mentioned that very detail as like one of the more influential parts of her sleep routine, was the fact that doing it at the consistent time. Because it's really tempting for all of us to just say, well, if 10 hours is the goal or 8 hours is the goal, but I went to bed at midnight and I usually go to bed at 10, I'll just get up later. But that's really tricky. That isn't as good for you, right?
No, there are certain, circadian rhythms and cues that take place at particular times. And if you're trying to fly in the face of that on a, pretty irregular basis, that's it's not going to pan out the way you're hoping. Avoid light sources, especially blue light sources. Everybody knows this. And I try to do it a couple hours before bed. If you have the option, try to lower the lights. Meditation goes a long way, man. Amaret's been meditating, and she has more deep sleep in a night than I see in a week. Sauna time. If you're gonna do sauna, if you're spending time doing heat training, or you're simply, the person who spends time in a sauna each night, that's a good way to kick off that temperature increase and then the temperature drop that cues the sleep that we're looking for, the deep sleep. Especially a hot shower can accomplish the same thing, and then a cool bedroom, especially if you're a hot sleeper. Falling asleep while you're too hot. Right now we've got a lot of smoke in the air, and the temperature outside is sky high. And as much as I hate running the AC all night, that's what we've been doing, and sleep's been good because of it. It hasn't been affected. But that temperature drop is a big deal. And then, like I said, just make yourself stay in bed for a little while. It might not be sleep, but just stay in bed. Just get used to it and force yourself to do it. Because if you give yourself the option of getting up, I'm an hour early, but I'm not going to fall asleep again, you'll get up and you're never going to reestablish these patterns.
Sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
I was just going to ask one tip on this, and ask for Amber and Alex for your recommendations in this. When you're training and you're carrying a training load, like all of these things, like you're mentioning, Chad, it can be really difficult to go to sleep, especially if your workouts are later. Like whether it's because your legs just feel almost like that half asleep feeling where they're a bit tingly and uncomfortable because of the hard workouts, or whether it's just because the workout was late and you're too revved up. What tricks have you put in place to be able to make yourself go to sleep on difficult nights when you're in the middle of either a race or a training block? Amber, did you find anything that helped when you were going through your racing career?
Oh, the consistency piece is huge. And I always found that there was like this bell curve of being able to fall asleep. So when I would get into training at first, and, just to some extent, sorry, my headset's talking to me. So at some point, a little bit of training would make it much easier to fall asleep. And then as the training ramped up or the intensity of racing ramped up, it would get much, much more difficult to fall asleep. And to not stress out about it. Just go to bed at the usual time. You don't need to lay there and stress about the fact that you can't sleep. And just know that, like, especially leading into a race, one bad night of sleep is not going to make or break anything. So taking the pressure off, I think, is a big thing that helps. It's not easy to do, but usually if you have one bad night of sleep, the next night your body's going to be a little extra tired and it'll be a little bit easier. So it's not something to like really don't put a ton of pressure on yourself about it, because that ends up being counterproductive.
Is there anything that you found as well? Those are great tips, by the way. The pressure part is hard because I always feel like I need to go to sleep, but that only makes things worse. Alex, have you found anything that helps you get to sleep after big training blocks or tough days?
I pretty consistently take cold showers before I go to bed. So it's the temperature drop. So just like a 5-minute cold shower before bed. And I'm a hot sleeper, so like that piece for me is huge. The consistency as well, especially when traveling. Like when I traveled to Cyprus, like I woke up at 3 a.m. and I just laid in bed till 7, because it's like I'm trying to get to go to bed at 9, wake up at 7. Like that was the routine. So it's like the thing you want to do is wake up, right? You don't really want to lay there for 4 hours. And that's definitely on the extreme end. But just like Chad said, it's not going to happen. Like if you're used to sleeping 12 to 7, you're not just going to be able to go to bed at 9 and wake up at 7. So it's like kind of incrementally changing that. And for doing this while traveling, you can do the same thing, like move it up half an hour to try to get on the time zone. Like if you're traveling from West Coast to East Coast, you can start moving your bedtime up half an hour as before you move and wake up at 4 if you have the ability. And then by the time you're on the East Coast, you're actually already on that time.
Yeah. You've probably done that a bunch, Amber, with bouncing back and forth between Europe and US and all that. So
Yeah, I tell you, well, one of the things that sucks about jet lag is it gets worse the older you get, because the older you get, the more ingrained your circadian rhythms become, and then the more disruptive things like jet lag become. So it's not something that's ever going to get easier, but there are those small things that you can do to help. And I totally agree. I think this is one of those things that you want to focus on in terms of building a long-term habit, as opposed to trying to like make some major overhaul all of a sudden. So really, Chad had a ton of great suggestions. Pick one that you think is going to be really, really doable. Like what's the easiest change, like the smallest and easiest change that you could make, and then try to do that for a couple of weeks and build it into your habit and your routine so that it becomes second nature. And it's not a decision that you're making, it's just an automatic behavior. And then try tweaking some, the next small thing, but don't feel like you have to go over and completely overhaul your sleep routine. Just small changes at a time will be far more effective, right? Because if it's not something that you have to decide every day, it's more likely to be something that you'll do consistently. And as we always say, consistency is really where it's at.
Yeah. Branching away from the sleep side of things and looking at his question through another lens, this is the question that I see a lot of the time when people say, well, I have 20 hours a week. So let's say that for some reason it's not useful to dedicate more time to sleep because that part's just locked down, right? So let's just assume that. If this is the case, I think that it's always tricky because it's one of those situations where it's just because you can doesn't mean you should. Like if I had 20 hours to train, it doesn't mean that my body could necessarily tolerate or improve with 20 hours of training, right, Chad? Like more doesn't just make you faster.
No, I've said it. Amber said it. I'm pretty sure all of us at one time or another have said something similar, is just because you can doesn't mean you should. And now you've got all this time, but can your body actually handle that stress? And what that translates to is, does it actually have the adaptive means to do so? Because even world level athletes have adaptive limitations. They can only inflict so much stress and have the body respond to it favorably before they can inflict more stress. So, maybe you're operating on 10 hours of training time right now, and now you've got 20. Doesn't mean train for 10 more. Doesn't mean double your training volume, because I promise that's going to backfire. So ramp your volume up slowly. And if any part of this is including more intensity than you've had in the past, ramp it up really slowly. And slowly can mean over the course of a week. Maybe you add an extra 30 minutes or extra 3 intervals over the course of 30 minutes to your VO2 max workout. Maybe you start tacking on an hour here of easy riding. Maybe that Wednesday off the bike is now a Wednesday on the bike for an hour. But those small changes, they don't take too long for you to say, yes, I can or cannot handle this. I mean, all of them will probably pan out, or you'll see where they're going to take you within a couple, 3 weeks time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel like this is a good year to try that stuff too. Like with no racing on the calendar, it's like I remember, everything having to be perfect because my race is 2 weeks out. Like I don't want to blow myself up now, but it's like with no races on the calendar, it's the time to like, does VO2 work for me? Can I do a 12-hour week? Can I do a 13-hour week? Like, and then if you can't, then just give yourself that rest. It's like there's nothing on the calendar to peak for anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. We have like a lot more flexibility than we've had in the past with that sort of stuff. So there are perks and silver linings to this whole thing. That's for sure. The other part of it too is like, let's say my body could take 20 hours of training stress, right? I don't think my life would allow that. And I'm not talking like on a calendar schedule, but I mean the other stress that I have in my life as well, right? And you don't have to have 5 kids and 4 dogs and chickens to be able to like say that you have a lot of stress or something. It's everybody has a certain dosage that's probably meet to their abilities to manage at this point, because we generally kind of hit a stasis around that. Like we kind of get as much stress as we can handle, and then we kind of float there. And every once in a while it spikes above, sometimes it spikes below. But that's another thing to think of. Like, and a lot of this goes into thinking, well, I did it before, so why can't I do it now? And I'm sure, Amber, for you, it's probably a similar situation. It's like you used to be like, yeah, 20 hours a week, no problem. But now, would it be harder with your job, I assume?
Yeah, I think physically it wouldn't be a problem, but then there's the emotional and mental stress that go along with that. And yeah, having a full-time job is a lot of mental, focus that's demanded in a way that's really different from what I used to do. And off the bike stress, it's going to vary a lot. So it's something that you need to take into account. And if you're looking at, for example, you want to start building up maybe volume or intensity. So you're looking to make this kind of like ramp up in a way that Chad's describing. Your off the bike stress is probably going to vary a lot from week to week. And that's okay. Just, so it's okay if you need to modify week to week or even perhaps day to day. It's totally fine. That's normal. That's life. We're all human beings. We're not robots. Just because you set a particular trajectory doesn't mean that you have to stick to it, and also doesn't mean that sticking to it is the best thing for you to do. So remember that even if you're making a smaller gain this week than you made last week, it's still a gain. And focus more on the direction that you're going rather than the magnitude of the gains that you're making, as an example. So let's say you need to adjust the rate of a TSS increase week to week. Just because you didn't have the same jump between last week and this week as you did between the previous week and last week, it's still a gain. You're still progressing in the right direction. So look at it more in terms of, are you moving in the direction of your goal, and focus a little bit less on the magnitude of distance that you're tracking with each workout or each week.
There's also like an element of this that when you train more, there's also more emotional stress. And we were talking about this actually in the planning meeting about how, when I go through like a really hard VO2 workout, I just put myself through an emotional war zone, right? Like there's a lot going on inside of me during that time where I'm trying to get more out of myself, but self versus self, one side of self is going, this is way too much and I can't handle it and it's too much stress. And I'm saying, stay focused on the task. You can do this, pull yourself through it. It's exhausting. It's not unlike, going through an argument with somebody and how stressful and difficult everything feels thereafter. And it's the same thing. So you have to think of that too. There's like, yeah, I could physically handle 20 hours, but especially like Chad said, a key point earlier on that may have not been gathered here. If not just volume is increasing, but intensity is increasing as well, that means that this training is going to be more stressful on you. So as a result, like you have to think that it's not just that the training stress is ramping up, but as you do more intense training and pack more of it into a shorter period of time, your emotional stress increases dramatically. And that has a way of affecting other sides of our life as well. So
yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Like even if we artificially bin off the bike stress, we'll set that aside for a second, and we're only looking at on the bike stress. To your point, we talk a lot about sympathetic activation in terms of the physicality of what we're doing, but there's also an emotional sympathetic activation going on, which is the emotions that are around that fight or flight, activating and marshaling all those resources to get through a really, really hard, a really intense workout. That's very emotional. very emotional. And that's not something that we usually talk about, but it's something that we like to separate, right? Like, oh, there's the physical stress and the mental stress, but they are very much connected, because you can't have one without the other.
Mm-hmm. And it's also like, it's worth saying that when you can complete those workouts and it's within your bandwidth to be able to emotionally manage that and physically manage that, man, it feels great. And the reason a lot of the time that it feels so great, and the reason that you should pat yourself on the back, is because you did just go through something physically and very emotionally hard. So that's why I think one of the reasons why we get this emotional high is because we're able to go through that sort of internal conflict, but then resolve it, right? And that feels incredible to us too. So it's something to consider, and this is one of the reasons why I don't necessarily feel this envy for pro athletes that put in a massive amount of hours. And you're unique in that regard, Alex, that you have to balance these things.
Well, I was going to say, I don't think it's necessary. Like, I understand it. People have this like 20-hour a week. It's like the 400 watt FTP, right? Like, it's on this pedestal of like, that's what the pros do. And it's like, not only just because you can doesn't mean you should, but I also want to make it clear, you don't need to train 20 hours a week to be successful by any means. Like, I'm guilty of it too, but I think Nate mentioned this, like, athletes love to broadcast their biggest week, their best power, Instagram's a highlight reel. So it's like everything on there is just people's like best experience, where it's like my usual week is like 12 hours tops. And it's like, before I would extend the ride time to 20 hours, I would spend some time rolling. I would spend some extra time sleeping. I'd spend some time in the boots. Like, I would throw more recovery aspect in there and pack more intensity into those 12 hours and see if I could handle more workload before I was wanting to handle more hours.
Actually, and that's a great point. And we'll kind of, like in our doc, everybody will kind of bump running down just below on this, because that's like separating training time versus time on the bike. Like, a lot of athletes say when they come into TrainerRoad and they're about to sign up, they'll send our support team questions, which is totally cool, by the way. Our support staff is awesome and ready to help with that. And a lot of the time, Chad or myself, somebody, we all like chime in as well and helping those support agents answer those questions. So to be clear, the best spot to answer or ask your questions is trainerroad.com/podcast, and we can get them through here. But when that happens, a frequent thing that we see is a person says, hey, like, I'm doing 20 hours a week, and looks like your plan, like the highest plan, is going to have me going for somewhere around like 6 to 8 hours a week. So what do I do? Like, I can tolerate a whole lot more. But there's a key thing here, and you have to separate just time on the bike versus training time. They're two totally different things, right, Chad? Like you can't just treat them all as the same.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think with 20 extra hours, the assumption is that I'm training 12 hours. Now I've got 8 more hours. How am I going to spend those 8 hours? I'm going to dedicate 3 of them to endurance. I'm going to dedicate 2 of them to muscular endurance. And you get it all mapped out. And then you realize there's a lot of other components. There's a lot of other cogs in this machine. I've got, if you're a multi-sport athlete, I mean, we're talking cycling here, but you got travel time to the pool. If you even a cyclist, you got to get your kit together, get your shoes on, get your energy foods, even if it's 5 or 10 minutes of setup. And then at the end of it, there's the other side of things. And then there's the post-workout shower. But all these things accumulate time and cut into those 20 hours really rapidly.
Yeah. It's tough to manage. And remember that when you're just riding your bike, it doesn't mean that you're training. And it doesn't mean that you can spend that same amount of time all with structured training. Structured training doesn't necessarily mean high intensity. It could mean low intensity, right? But the important thing to remember is that it's still structured rather than just pedaling as you feel. And that makes it usually a whole lot harder to go through. Yeah. So the point stress.
To one of the things that Chad's talking about here, in addition to looking at this in terms of training stress and recovery, another important aspect to train is the transition from the training to the recovery, and training your flexibility in terms of your ability to switch from sympathetic to parasympathetic or back again is really, really helpful. So when you're done with your workout, being able to have a moment and dedicate time to transitioning out of one state to the other, resetting back into parasympathetic, that will help your system move more fluidly between the two states, which is a huge, first of all, it's a huge life benefit. But in terms of performance, it's also really, really helpful, because there are very few races where you're attacking every second of an entire race. There's always going to be these little micro recovery sections, whether it's between two attacks and maybe it's only 5 or 10 seconds, or it's on a less technical downhill, or it's on a flat section where you can really just get into a rhythm and you don't have to be as on, and you can maybe take a break and eat something. But the more that your body can switch between the parasympathetic, sympathetic, and you can flip into parasympathetic, maybe even mid-race, and get a little bit more recovery than the person next to you, that's a huge, huge benefit.
Yeah, that's also like something I've noticed, and it's been hard to manage with family a lot of the time because I'll come home from a workout or I'll get out of the garage and have just done a hard workout, and I feel like I kind of need some time to like rev down, right? And but then, you know, Simon wants to play, our little guy, or you know, I need to do chores or do something like that, or work is calling my name, something like that. That's another big thing to keep in mind. Like, and like you kind of hinted at, Chad, it all tacks on time to this training experience, because, you know, revving down from that. Also, it's really important to not just think that you need to be a machine and be able to just training done, like turn the page. Now I can continue and move on to the next thing and be unaffected. Like, it's hard. Then giving yourself a little bit of time can be really helpful. I mean, that's honestly, shower time that's why it's really good to be able to plan some sort of a shower right after if you need privacy, to be able to, you know, you're a busy mom and you have kids always asking for you. Maybe after training, you just always plan to have that shower, so then you can physically separate yourself from the other demands and give yourself time to rev down, something like that. But I think that is an important point, because I feel the pressure all the time to just be like, well, I should just be a robot. Like, this should be a part of my life. And I should be able to just separate it into chapters and carry through. But everything kind of does, you know, bleed together with that for sure. Chad, I jumped out of line here. Do you want to cover the running portion now, and then we'll continue on?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, let's save that for just after this next point.
Cool.
Just the training mix considerations. And Alex already mentioned that rather than dedicate more time, he'd rather see if he can dabble in a little more intensity and see how that pans out. And that's one of the two ways I see to go. The other would be to add on easy mileage. And I think that's the safer get. And if you want to occupy that time with time on the bike, it's probably the way to start. Even if you think you can handle more intensity, unless you're a savvy, experienced rider and you know that you're going to benefit from that added intensity, and something that's holding you back is the fact that you don't quite have, you know, you're not quite being pushed to that limit, then it's probably safer for you to start just adding on a little bit of time in the form of easier mileage. And I just wanted to suggest a couple of ways to do that. First and foremost, if you've got a lot of time, I love the long weekly ride. So if you can take a Sunday and go out and ride for 4 or 5 or 6, or maybe 2 hours is a long ride for you, but something that is outside of your comfort zone, at least, geez, 50, maybe, we don't need to put a number on it, but it has to put you in a point where this is unfamiliar territory. And light, easy stuff. You don't have to bury yourself. We were just trying to go long and easy. That'd be my first suggestion, even if it's on a bi-weekly basis or an every 10 day. If your schedule is super flexible. The other is 2-a-days. I mean, just you have your high intensity in the morning, or maybe you have it in the evening, but whichever time is free, spend 30, 45, an hour doing that same thing. It doesn't have to be high intensity. In fact, it shouldn't even be really moderate intensity. It should be easy until you figure out how you can accommodate it, how your body responds to it. The other is those fasted morning rides. I mean, that goes in line with the 2-a-days, and they convey a lot of benefit if you can make yourself get out of bed, get on the bike, do that easy work. And however you run the rest of your day nutritionally, knowing that you have a higher intensity work later, or vice versa. But one of those 2 rides can be fasted. Probably be better if it was the one where you're just coming out of bed. And then the probably the easiest get is just extend that recovery at the end of any workout. Tack on 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, set the intensity where it's easily manageable, and then just see how you respond to what may amount to 3 or 4 or 5 extra hours by the end of the week.
Yeah. This is probably the most measurable, or I should say like incremental way to be able to add stress upon stress, right? And to be able to add it in and measure and see. And it's important also to not just probably take judgments off of one workout, but to actually look like, okay, so I didn't just do my first morning ride and it went perfectly well, so then I'll tack on many more, but it's probably worth you working that in, you know, slowly but surely still. Because it's super tempting to, once you do it first time, and if it goes really well, to just sign on board and throw it all over the place. or vice versa too. If it goes really poorly, it's like, yeah, never doing that again. But it's something that you should definitely look into, like, figuring out how it works.
Yeah.
If this is new territory to you, play it more cautiously than someone like Alex can, who's got a lot of experience to build on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really like the incremental approach to that. And I think one of the things that should be taken into consideration here too is just the time buffer. So as an example, if you have an extra 20 hours in a week, maybe not scheduling every minute of that and allocating all of that to some aspect of training, whether it's on the bike training, off the bike training, recovery, because there is something to be said for having a little bit of time buffer just for scheduling unexpected changes to your schedule. So for example, if I'm going to just, take a different time scale, if I'm going to go do a 5-hour ride, I'm not scheduling that for 5 hours on the nose. I'm definitely scheduling in some buffer in case I flat, if I need to stop and refuel or fill up my bottles. You just never know what can happen on a ride. So I'm going to add in a little bit of time buffer there into my schedule. And then that way I'm not really stressed out on the bike if something happens. And the same thing goes for a week-long schedule or a month-long schedule. If you have the luxury of having a little bit of time buffer in there that can help you accommodate unexpected changes, that's a huge stress reliever. And again, relieving some off the bike stress will definitely be helpful for the quality of the training that you're actually doing during the week. So that might be another thing that could be a valuable use of your time, is to just not schedule it.
Yeah, we've mentioned this before, but consistency is largely the most impactful thing a person can have on their training. If you can train more consistently, like when we look at like those that are improving their FTP on an anonymous and very large scale, we see that consistency is the overbearing, overbearing consistency, if you will, amongst all of those people, and that it's a real thing. And man, like, I can fit in a high volume plan, a TrainerRoad high volume plan according to the numbers every week, but I don't. I follow a mid volume plan because I know that consistency is important. And some weeks I might even not just have time for a low volume plan, and some weeks I'm going to have time for a high volume. But if I plan to give myself that cushion room, like you're talking about, Amber, chances are my training won't be as derailed. And I'd much rather be consistent and slightly below pushing my limits, because by the end of the year, I think that's going to yield more benefit than by trying to push my limits constantly and then, crashing, so to speak, in terms of just not being able to train at all and having to take time off and going through that whole process. Maybe and I guess this is 1.2, and then we'll get to the running part on the last section here, but it's also totally what one person says for their job is going to be totally different for another person. There are some athletes, like locally an athlete, Jose Cuevas, like he is so impressive to me that he's a roofing contractor, and he spends a lot of the day up on that roof, bent over, hammering, lifting things, like doing really heavy work. And then he still shows up at the crit and he still spanks me, right? Like he's a really, really good athlete. And while that may not be too much stress for him with his training and racing and everything else with his job, another person with a desk job, that may just be too much stress for them to be able to handle. And because it's all relative to the individual and what's going on. So you do have to consider like the nature of your job, and if that nature will change over time as well. If you have a seasonal work, you're an accountant and Aprils are just nuts for you, right? Or something else like that. These are all things you have to take into account. Our lives aren't static, but they definitely, above all, are not comparable one to the other. It all changes. So one job might be easier than another. Running, let's talk about that. Multi-sport athletes would laugh at this, but for us cyclists, any time that we want to incorporate running, Sean, one of our great copywriters, actually just wrote a great and funny blog post on this. It was because we're focused on how to make you faster, but he wrote this somewhat cheeky article that's all about how to get slower as a cyclist. And it's actually really good because if you look at it and read it, there are key things that can be like, oh no, I do that. And then hopefully we can stop doing it. But within that, like one of the main things I feel like is that a lot of cyclists do is like, I'm just going to incorporate some running. I'm just going to do a couple runs. And like every time it's like the undoing of everything that has to do with your legs and body, right? Because we're not used to it.
It sounds so innocuous. Like I'm just going to run a couple times. Maybe I'm just going to do a couple 20 or 30-minute runs. But the abuse that can inflict on a body that is not used to that form of stress can be a really big deal. And it can absolutely derail your cycling progress too. So Brent, the question is, do you have a run background? Because if you do, you probably know, what you can get away with initially, and then, see how that first week or two go. But if you don't, then you have to weave it in gently. And I would suggest starting with one. And I know to some, it probably sounds shameful to run for only 20 minutes, but keep it to 20 minutes. See how that goes, especially if you're on varied terrain. Because if you're running downhill for any of that 20 minutes, it's going to take a far heavier toll than either uphill or flat running. Secondly, maybe it's just cross training. And if that's the case, there are a lot of ways that you can cross train. It doesn't necessarily have to be running. I do understand that it's the most accessible. Requires the least amount of equipment, and it's super easy to add running in terms of scheduling and whatnot. Or maybe you're just aiming for variety. Excuse me. In both those cases, though, I would still steer you back to strength training. If it's not already part of your program and you have the time to dedicate to it, forget the running. Focus on being a better rider and add in some strength training, because that'll pay bigger dividends than the running will. And it impacts it affects your joint health. And a lot of the things that you look for in running will be conveyed with the strength training, added to the other benefits that come with strength training.
Alex, your partner.
I will just say,
oh yeah, sorry.
I was going to say,
ahead.
I would be absolutely destroyed if I ran for 20 minutes. Like that would destroy me for a month.
I was going to ask that, Amber.
Exactly.
Which pro cyclist, when you were going through with your pro career, was it common for pro cyclists to ever run?
Only in the off season, and I didn't really know any cyclists who were particularly good runners. In fact, I mean, that's actually the way I got into cycling. Was when I stopped swimming, I still had this huge aerobic engine, but I had, to Chad's point, like I didn't have a run background, so I didn't have the form or the mechanics or any of those stabilizer muscles developed whatsoever. In fact, I wasn't used to doing anything that involved gravity. And then I started running, but I had a big enough aerobic engine that I ran to the point of stressing that aerobic engine, not to the point of where my skill set ended in terms of the mechanics of the running. And it was so bad that I was in grad school and my advisor got so tired of me complaining about feeling destroyed that he actually gave me his bike. I mean, it was that bad. He just said, for the love, please just have my bike. Try something else. This is awesome. Clearly not working for you.
Alex,
it can get ugly quick. I'll just say that.
Oh, it's so bad. And like to your point too, with like pacing, like when you go out running, it like you'll probably be able to run faster than an average person at first too, right?
Which is not a good thing.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, don't get carried away with the pats on the back with that one. Be like, whoa, rein it in. Like when I'm thinking about triathlon in the future for us doing triathlon training, which actually once we get into like late October, I'm going to be this person here. I'm going to be working and running very slowly, but with the intention that when a year wraps around and we actually start training in earnest, that at that point, hopefully I can run once a week and not be completely destroyed. Right. So to kind of build up some sort of background on this, but when I go out and run, it feels really good to run at like a low 6-minute pace because I'm used to like a certain amount of aerobic demand and intensity from cycling. But I'm forcing myself to run at 10-minute pace and like super slow and to only do a mile and to like just, very slowly, gradually work that up. Alex, your partner, Jen, she runs quite a lot and she does some crazy trail runs too, by the way. Did she ever bring you out for running? And then how do you manage that with your training?
Oh man, a lot is an understatement.
Yeah.
She's currently training for 100K, which just blows my mind. I don't even know how to start running 63 miles.
Yeah.
She gets me at my weakest. I take 2 weeks off the bike every year, and she knows just a week into that, like I'm just recovered enough mentally that like I'm itching to do something, but I can't ride my bike yet. So she starts like, you want to run a 5K? You want to run with me today? And then I finally break down. So I do a 5K a year, and every morning, the next morning I wake up a brick and she has to like push me out of bed to get started.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely something that for us cyclists temper that temptation to just become a runner all of a sudden. So
yeah, I don't know what you mean by comfortably running 6-minute pace though. I struggle with 10-minute pace, full gas. So
yeah, running is hard.